Are we going to return to a more mythological understanding of reality? But boy, that just goes against everything we've been trained at for 300 years. So how would that be? I mean, how would our social, political, economic institutions survive?
Hello and welcome to Why Are We Talking About Rabbits? That's this podcast where we look at heavy things lightly. Sometimes heavy things are known as history. A lot of you out there don't like history, but today we're going to do some. We're going to look at the word secular. What is it? Where did it come from? How come some spaces are secular and you don't talk about God or Muhammad or Jesus? And how come some places aren't? That's a historical development. And today, we're going to talk about that very heavy idea, but we're going to do it lightly with Father John Strickland. He is a priest in the Orthodox tradition, but he is also a master historian with many books, including a trilogy of sorts that he's writing right now. There's actually 4 of them, but you got to hear from him and you got to read these books. This is WAWTAR. Why are we talking about rabbits? This is episode 57. What is the secular? What is the seculum? How does it work? A history of things secular. Father John Strickland, you've come on to WAWTAR. Why are we talking about rabbits? You're a good man. It's great to have you on. Father John Strickland is out in Washington. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I want you to know I've been using your books in a lot of the things I've been trying to do in introducing First Things Foundation. And so many times they answer all these questions about this old world, new world divide. So, Father, welcome to WAWTAR and our work here. Thanks for coming on. Why don't you tell folks about yourself a little bit out in Washington State?
You bet, John. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on your show. I enjoy a lot of the stuff you've done so far. I was watching some of the episodes and really enjoying your guests. So I'm honored that you invited me to be on today.
You're a better man than most. For sure.
I'm a parish priest. That's my main work. That's what I do at a parish in Poulsbo, Washington. And that's located in the Kitsap Peninsula, which is west of Seattle, across Puget Sound from Seattle. So we have a relatively small Orthodox parish here, OCA, Parish St. Elizabeth, the New Martyr. Mm-hmm. I've been here about 7 years. I came here from Southern California, where I was doing a lot more teaching than I've done more recently. Now it's called the University. Right? Yeah, that's right. Strictly speaking, San Marcos now, but University of St. Catherine. It was called St. Catherine College when I was there, and started a podcast when I was teaching there called Paradise and Utopia, and that just really is the kind of culmination of I guess it's been about a quarter of a century that I've been teaching college, right. And I've always loved the history of Christian civilization, Christendom. And I had a chance to put together a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio that provided me with the opportunity to try out some ideas. It's a long history. It's from Pentecost to the present. So crazy, yeah. There's a lot of material there. And so I started that then. And more recently, since I moved up here about 7 years ago, I've started to put it into book form. It's actually, the books are different than the podcast. It's not the same thing. It's it's a different kind of presentation of that history, but I've been doing that for a while now, a few years now. I've got 2 volumes out, and the next volume on the way. There'll be 4 in all. The next volume on the way is Age of Utopia. It follows Age of Division, and then the first volume, Age of Paradise. Age of Utopia is in manuscript, and it should be out in November. Then there's one more volume after that.
Age of Utopia. Oh, there's one more after Age of Utopia.
Yeah. Age of Utopia gets us to the Russian Revolution, so we still have a century of the history of the West to cover. What's that?
Hey, I didn't know that. If you all, I'm telling you, if you want a good history, I don't care what kind of history you're after. If you want an exhaustive history, but one well told, these are really good. Father, this is the stuff we were talking off camera about. Philip Sherrard, and just about what happens when your mind starts to get turned around. And my mind gets turned around in my 20s through an experience living in West Africa and then an experience diving into history, because my experience there made me think, what's happening? And why is this happening this way? What is this Islam? How do Africans get it? And then you start realizing, wait, there's Christians in Ethiopia. And then I start thinking, and I went down the rabbit hole and came out the other end, Orthodox. And your books, I feel like they were the book. The story being told is the story I learned in order for me to get clarity on this really profound worldview. So I used the Paradise big time when I was teaching my last class with our reoccurring donors, which I'll make a pitch to reoccurring donors. Hop on First Things Foundation. We love you guys. So Father, let's do this. I think the way to go, using your expertise, is to talk about this new world concept, which is, you and I know, and I think our listeners know, a very, very, very new world concept called the secular. Something, well, I'll let you describe it. Something neutral, right? What is it in your mind after all this writing and reading and research and living as a priest, and where does it come from?
Yeah. I mean, the word secular is it's just part of our modern vocabulary, isn't it? I mean, it's a word that just is there. But it's a neologism. If you look at history in the long term sense, as I try to do, in my project, it has about, well, it depends on how you measure it, but it's been prominent for no more than 500 years and really even less than that. Right. It had its origins, and there's a couple of books that can be read about its origins as a concept, but it had its origins in the West, in Christendom, and especially was promoted by St. Augustine, and who died in the early 5th century, right, as he tried to grapple with a different cosmology, a different worldview than had been widespread in Christendom for the past 300 years since it originated at Pentecost.
Can I stop you right there? So historically, as succinct as you can, Augustine he's leaving something, but not totally. What is he leaving? What cosmology is he moving away from? Can you explain that in I don't want to say a heartbeat, but something like 6 heartbeats?
Yeah, 9 words or less is my favorite way of putting that, and always exceed the 9 words. Well, I mean, so I'm not a specialist in Augustine. It's sure. So I'm depending on the research, the secondary research that I've been able to do. But one thing that seems to strike me as I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I see things. I'm Western, but I'm also an Orthodox Christian, right, which is a really kind of unusual kind of perspective to have. And so I see Augustine from, as it were, the East. And what we see in the East, what we see in contemporary writings, even before Augustine, and I think we can trace it all the way back to the New Testament, mm-hmm, is a Christian civilization, Christian culture, kind of a counterculture and a proto-civilization that emerges from Pentecost, and I argue this in the first volume, mm-hmm, that takes its place in the world and develops its own cosmology, which cosmology I would call unitary. That is to say, it sees the world as being touched by and entered by divinity. Okay. Through the incarnation. Okay, so this incarnational faith that Christianity has had from day one fundamentally shaped how Christians looked on the world, the cosmos. And because the incarnation brought God into this world, he took human flesh, he blessed things that were physical. You look at the New Testament and the Old Testament too, and there's no sense that there's a secular kind of area or of the world that's neutral without God, and then there's a sacred one. It's God is to be found everywhere.
That's right.
What happens is that unitary cosmology, which gets its best expression by a Eastern bishop named Eusebius, writing about a century before Augustine, okay, emphasized that
which we would call the Dark Ages. The Westerners this is something like Dark Ages, fall of Rome. They're seeing Rome fall apart and writing and trying to make sense of the world using this Christian cosmology. I just want to give folks out there, if you studied a little bit of history, this is something like the Dark Ages, the early period after the fall of Rome.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Rome is sacked for the first time in 410. So and Augustine lives through it. And in fact, that's very relevant to the conversation we're having about cosmology, because before Rome is sacked in the West, and it's never sacked in the East, the new Rome, Constantinople, was the capital of the Roman Empire in its Christian form and continued to be so for hundreds of years. But in the West, yes, it was sacked and it fell apart and disintegrated. But anyway, there was this unitary understanding of the cosmos, that there was the presence of God was very real, very immediate in this cosmos, and therefore the world was not separated radically from God. Now, there was very clearly a Christian doctrine about the world, and Christians are not of the world, they're
in the world.
They live in the world, but they're not of the world. All that stuff, we can talk about that if we want. But Augustine witnesses, first of all, the sack of Rome, 410. He didn't see it firsthand, but he waited for the same armies to come south to Hippo in North Africa, where he was living. He actually dies while they're besieging Hippo as bishop there. And he develops a strikingly different cosmology in his famous City of God.
Right.
And in that famous work, beautiful work, powerful work, a work that every Christian should read or be familiar with, at least at some level. In that work, he creates a dualistic cosmology, not the unitary one that I think was really strong before his time, but a dualistic one. He recognized that this world is broken, and the fall of Rome to the barbarians was like the wake-up call, as it were, the shock that made him start to think we shouldn't be too attached to and too naive about the goodness of this world, which Eusebius was naive. He was a little too naive about it. And so Augustine got really strict, and he said, no, the world has this thing called the saeculum in it. It's a Latin word. It translates the Greek word eon, which is used in the New Testament. It means age, but it specifically means of this age in this world now, not the kingdom of heaven, not the eschatological age, as it were, that breaks into this world through the incarnation in God's sacramental liturgical presence in the world, but rather the saeculum is this neutral space, as it were.
It is a type of neutrality. It's a type. Yeah. Now, he's not going to push God all the way out of that space. That Absolutely happens, not. But he doesn't
Absolutely
do that.
Not. No, he doesn't do that, but he does dramatically restrict his sense of how the world can be sanctified. So before Augustine undertakes this project in the City of God, there wasn't such a clear sense anywhere, even in pagandom, in pagan civilization, that there was this neutral space that was neither, good or bad, spiritual or unspiritual. There was the profane, which is like, immorality and disorder, stuff like that. And then there was the sacred, which is the holy, the presence of God. The Christians more or less embraced such a unitary cosmology. And then Augustine inserts into it this saeculum, which now more and more offers an alternative to either the sacred or the profane, and now it becomes a neutral space that Christians occupy. Now, I don't want to spend let's keep going, because basically it's going to be another 500-600 years before that idea. A full 1,000. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's a millennium before that gets acted on, radically by Renaissance humanists.
So the papal Reformation's 1100s, they're not picking that up necessarily, but they're going to use vocabulary that allows folks in the Renaissance to pick it up. Am I right about that? Talk a little bit. So if you know your history, guys, just real quickly, if you like WAWTAR, we do a lot of history. Basically what's happening is the Christian worldview, now there's variations on that, are winding their way through various pagan cultures, the Goths, right? all the Germanic tribes are picking up Christianity, but which flavors, right? And we don't want to get into medieval. We can if we want to, but there's all these flavors of Christianity be picked up, and one of them is going to eventually be this flavor of the seculum. Am I saying that right? In some ways?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what goes on, by the 11th century, and this is a really important turning point. So I'm glad you mentioned the Papal Reformation. What happens is, the Augustine's dualistic cosmology takes hold in the West, and it's there for hundreds of years. It never dominates like, in the modern West at all, but it's kind of there. And then it's used as a resource to draw upon by advocates for reform, yes, namely papal reform, right, beginning with the 11th century. So you get popes like Leo IX, who presides over sending the famous embassy to Constantinople under Cardinal Humbert, which results in the mutual excommunications of 1054.
Split.
Then more famously, you've got Gregory VII, Hildebrand, who's more radical in trying to reform the Western Church. And as these papal reformers and their supporters, Peter Damian and people like that, are advocating reform of the West, they're doing two things simultaneously. One is they're demanding the East to submit to papal influence, okay, and papal supremacy. That's their Eastern policy. Their Western policy is to demand that the seculum, and here's where they apply this concept,
okay,
that is to say, rulers like emperors and princes and such submit to them as the spiritual authority over them. Uh-huh. So whereas you don't have secularization in the modern sense, where you get this idea of a neutral territory that has no spiritual value, you do get this radical bifurcation, this separation of two classes of civilization, Christendom, mm-hmm, where one is clerical and it's led by the Pope,
yes,
and it's trying to impose itself on the lay element. And the lay element is seen as kind of the recipient of these reforming efforts. And so you get a really strong sense of secularization in that sense, where the clergy take on this role as the leaders, and the laity, the vast majority of people in the West, are supposed to just follow the guidance of the reformers.
Is that because the reformers, the papal reformers, the folks who are trying to figure out really how to rule in a lot of ways, are they seeing the laity as in need of purification? Are they seeing them as needing to get out of the seculum, to get away from that which is not of God? Is there some sort of, I don't know, feels like a mission?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, in the second volume, Age of Division, I call it the evangelizing the seculum. I think certainly that's the term that I use. They're trying to bring the gospel as they understand it to bear on the seculum, which they consider to be really, very, very separated from traditional Christianity and proper church order. I mean, that's what the papal reform is about, is to try to evangelize society. It's a remarkably spiritual movement, remarkably, and it's brilliant in a lot of what it does, the Papal Reformation does. But it has the side effect of bifurcating the West, so that you have the church now becomes simply the clergy, and the laity are kind of passive, passively receiving the leadership of the clergy in this reform effort.
Is this where you get the memes of this is out of, you hear this in Protestantism in the United States. This is the story of they didn't let them read the Bible, this kind of thing. They didn't let people participate. The clergy, forced certain perspectives on commoners. Is that where this is that period? Am I right?
This is that period. This is the period where you really see a strong distinction made between the clergy that live by a high standard of holiness, and the laity that are kind of dismissed as second-class spiritual citizens in this society. This is the time, actually, when clerical celibacy becomes absolutely necessary. Now, there had been canons way back, hundreds of years back. There had been expectations that priests would be celibate, or if they had a wife, they would not have relations with their wife after their ordination. But by the 11th century, a great number, perhaps the majority, we don't really know, a great number of Western priests are in relationship with either wives or concubines. And there's a strong effort as part of the Reformation, papal Reformation, to insist on clerical celibacy. And so that's when, if we want to trace clerical celibacy, circa 2021 back in time, that's really the moment when, it takes over a century to get worked out, but that's kind of the moment when that happens.
It's 1,000 years ago. Exactly. Pretty much. Yeah.
And it corresponds more or less with the Great Schism, the Great Division.
So now let's move into the Renaissance and the humanists. Why I don't think it's clear yet in the story that you're telling, which is really interesting. I don't think it's clear yet why Christians would pick up the idea of the secular and then move God out of it. I don't see reasons for that yet. I don't understand why God would, because listen, we're at a point now where, there is no God in most public places in America, almost all of them. I don't know that that's necessary yet in this story. What happens? What happens?
And as an historian, there are limits to what we were ever really going to understand. But the story as I see it, and I try to tell it, is it has another dimension to the one we're just talked about. The one we've talked about so far is this dualistic cosmology in which one element, the clergy in this case, tries to evangelize the seculum, this neutral, non-spiritual element in society, and make it spiritual. Mm. But at that begins in the 11th century, wholeheartedly in the papal Reformation. But the Great Schism or Great Division that I referred to, which is kind of marked by the excommunications of 1054, when the Roman Catholic Church is created and the Orthodox Church in the East with Constantinople, all of that is distinct from the Roman Catholic Church. That also plays a role in this. And so what I certainly think is the case is that way back, for the first millennium, you have a real common culture, East and West, but the strength of a society that really is filled with a sense of the incarnational presence of God, heavenly immanence, mm-hmm. where liturgy and sacramental life and penance and every penitential life and everything is filled with that sense of God's presence, what I call paradise. That is always stronger in the East. Okay. It's stronger in the East, and the separation from the East puts the West on a trajectory, which I would argue, I know people would disagree with me, especially from the West, but I think it can be argued, and I do this in my books, it puts the West on a trajectory where more and more, it takes centuries to work out, the experience of this world, the cosmology of Western civilization becomes less and less filled with that sense of divine presence or heavenly immanence. And so by about the 13 or 1400s, that's several hundred years after the papal Reformation, there are examples, we can find them, people often talk about them, of a real negative or pessimistic piety in the West. I mean, the dance of death, or sometimes the Dies Irae is seen as being like ominously frightening. Mm-hmm. Some of the altarpieces, there's some really harrowing painting that's done in the 1300s and especially the 14 and 1500s that are just frightening.
This is Dante too, right?
Dante is kind of like just before this gets really striking, because Dante still has a tremendous sense of God's presence and all of that in his Divine Comedy. But
there's a darkness there too.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly the purgatory doctrine, which is new at this time. There are several things that are really new in Western Christendom after the Great Division. One of them is purgatory. It can be traced back to Gregory the Great in the West, but it becomes an official dogma of the Roman Catholic Church only after the Great Schism.
Right.
Well, purgatory pushes paradise and the experience of heaven way off into the future. You have to die and then endure punishment and suffering. Like sometimes it's harrowing, like hell, the way it's depicted. That kind of really puts a damper on one's experience of heavenly immanence.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, I play fantasy football and I get on there, and if anyone on that string ever says anything religious, which they don't, but if it does, it might be the word purgatory. That's a word they would know without actually knowing much about it.
Yeah, so that limbo, right? Yeah,
yes,
limbo.
It's that right, imminent in the minds of people who aren't even talking or thinking much about God. So it's definitely
right. And so I think it's that it's that idea, John, of this world, this cosmos, the cosmology, no longer having a strong sense of God's presence,
right,
and more emphasizing the need for punishment, the need for judgment, the need for expiation, things like this. Again, looking at images of Christ whose body is bleeding horrifically, seeing emotional images, beginning with Giotto in the 14th century, of people beholding the crucifixion of Christ and in agony and grief. This just grows by the time the Reformation comes about, so that it all kind of blows up. And that's what I argue in the second and third volumes is that this penitential piety, this penitential pessimism really kills the healthy, you might say organic, integral culture, spiritual culture of the West, of Christendom.
Let's do this for a second. One of the things that happens with me as I teach, and now, or up until when I started First Things, is there is still a sense among a typical 17-year-old that Christianity somehow is the things you just described. Mm-hmm. Sad, it makes me have to be punished. And so what I'm wondering is if that voice is still around, even after all these years of trying to extinguish it, how deeply did this get into the psyche of the West? It's so amazing that this is my question. It does seem there almost had to be some kickback. There had to be something that would push against this sort of penitential piety that you're talking about. And is this where we talk about Petrarch? Is he one of these people who push back?
So this is Petrarch's story. So Petrarch dies in about 1374, I think it is, lives in the middle of the 14th century. And he highly, really sensitive, brilliant, intellectual, and he reacts against this. You read some of his works, and he's full of grief about his sins. He wrote a work called Secretum, where he has an imaginary conversation with Augustine, Saint Augustine, as if he's in a confessional with Saint Augustine, and he's saying, "I'm such a wretched person, and I can't ever conquer all of these sinful dispositions." And Augustine's message is, you just need to give up on life. You just need to stop hoping for anything in this life.
That's how those are the words he gives to Augustine.
I'm paraphrasing.
Right,
yeah,
sure,
but Augustine
but more
says
or
this
less.
to him in this imaginary confessional.
Wow.
And essentially the message of Augustine, therefore representing, Petrarch's understanding of Western Christendom, is this life is really a place where you're just going to be miserable until you die and just get ready for death. Now, Petrarch doesn't accept this.
Let me ask you something. If you're, so I know you're an intellect. Place yourself right there with Petrarch, 1400s?
Yeah, 1300s, yeah.
Late 1300s?
Yeah.
Do you think you react the same way, maybe? Because you wouldn't be fully aware of of the Christian East.
Yeah, absolutely.
You, as an intellect, might do the same thing? I think I might. I don't know.
Yeah, I still do. I love, we were talking about classical music before we started.
That's true. That's right.
You pressed record. I love the Seculum. I love the Seculum as it's been developed, and I need to watch that because it can become, a distraction, if not an idol for me as a Christian. But what we have beginning with Petrarch is a rebellion against this penitential piety, this pessimism, a rebellion where, yeah, he writes the book called Secretum that I just summarized, but he doesn't live that way. So you read the book, you think, okay, Augustine convinced him that he should just give up on life. But then you read his letters and he's delighting in his dog, and all this stuff. And he's writing to some local prince. It's so modern. He's writing to a local prince who oversees, because he's the law of that valley or something in France. There's a young man who seduced some young girl and they want to marry, but the young man's going to be executed because this is, a scandal for the community. Mm-hmm. And he's writing to the prince to intervene and say, no, let these lovebirds be happy together.
Really?
I mean, it's such you never see this stuff until Petrarch comes forward and he creates this space, or rather I call it retreats to this space that Augustine had already created with very different intentions. He retreats, Petrarch does, to the saeculum in order to defend himself. And back to your question, John, I probably would run with him to the saeculum in that situation, because there was so much that was overwhelmingly pessimistic about that culture at that time. There's a little bit more to the story I want to finish, but it makes me think of something. And I said we might go down a few we don't want to do rabbits. You know what that means in the title is things that are just, reproducing online and they aren't worth talking about. So I hope this isn't a rabbit trail. But do you sometimes too feel a little bit of empathy for this postmodern attempt to make meaning out of a world that's been pretty meaningless? Do you sometimes, or does postmodernism scare you? I jumped way up, but well, yes and no. So, or yes and yes, I'm not sure how to. Yeah, postmodernism offers, I think, Christians, let's just say Christians, wonderful support in repudiating the modernistic / atheistic / anti-Christian forces, intellectual forces especially, but also consumer economic forces.
Yes.
Of the past 300 years. So the Enlightenment was this overwhelming threat to Christianity, Christendom, for 300 years or so. Let's say 1750 to 1950.
That's exactly.
And then postmodernism. Foucault and Derrida and all these postmodernist philosophers emerge, and they kind of thumb their nose at Marx, and they thumb their nose at Freud, and they thumb their nose at other modernists. The Enlightenment project and all that stuff is exposed as being a power trip, and all. We won't get into all the details, but that's wonderfully liberating and can be used by Christian intellectuals to support our own critique of the Enlightenment project. Yeah.
Right. An old cosmology, old cosmology that actually feels new because when I speak to people who are atheists today, when you present the old cosmology, the Christian cosmology, they're like, whoa, I never heard of that. So it is, I agree with you. It provides a doorway into a kind of a cool conversation that wasn't really allowed.
I want to pick up on a point you started to make though earlier. And that was, is the narrative, the understanding that we find all around us that Christianity is pessimistic by nature. Okay. You read Nietzsche. He talks about Christianity as he calls it the worst thing that ever happened to civilization because it's so negative, right? Guilt and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, there is a place for penance. There is a place for repentance in Christianity for sure. Asceticism. We don't live for this world as Christians. We live for the kingdom of heaven.
That's right.
But what I try to do in my books, what I really think is the case of explaining the origin of our modern problems and everything, it's why I'm writing such a long history, is that because of the disjunction from Eastern Christendom, from the early first millennium experience of piety and Christian culture we find in the East, still kept alive strongly by the Orthodox Church, as well as some forms of Western Christianity today. When that break occurs and it becomes formalized in 1054, we see a trajectory that does ultimately result in a kind of Christianity that's pretty easy to to dismiss from a modern secular point of view. And it's that Christianity, of course, which is being, being attacked by these very kind of really superficial modern voices.
But that's
the Inquisition, right? The Inquisition always comes up. There was no Inquisition in the first millennium.
Nope.
And there never was in the East in any case after the first millennium. The Crusades, the East never fought Crusades. Right. There were some Byzantine wars, especially the ones against Persia under Heraclius, Emperor Heraclius, that had a kind of Christianity against pagandom kind of theme to them. But the church, her bishops never called on people to raise arms to fight wars. It was considered a sin to fight such wars. And we could go on and on. I mean, purgatory.
I like your word trajectory. I like your word trajectory, or I use disposition a lot on this pod. Once the disposition kicks in, once the trajectory kicks in, it's really hard to reroute it. That break, 1054, and all that goes with it, all the theological and philosophical implications. You're right. The trajectory is hard to reroute. And what you get is a series of rebellions against, and they all make sense to me. Now, we talk a lot about we're jumping around. I want to go back to Petrarch, but we talk a lot about the revolutions, the American, the French, and the Russian. And again, you start to see rebellions against that which might not be working. The problem is, and I think this is Petrarch's problem too. The problem is you can rebel, but what do you replace? What goes in place of that which was? And I'm always interested. It feels like the humanists, Petrarch and folks that came after him, they missed something. How would you describe the rest of that story with Petrarch? It seems like he's doing something human. And then what happens? Does it go sideways?
What happens is it's not just what Petrarch and his followers, the 15th century Italian, the more famous Italian humanists like Pico della Mirandola, or people like that, and then Thomas More, who writes the book called Utopia, and gives us a word to work with, write books around and stuff like that. Those humanists, they were doing their thing, but they were still Christians for the most part. They didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. What happened is cultural revolution. What happened is that the Reformation took place, and I argue strongly in my book, The Age of Division, that it's just the extension of the papal Reformation. I mean, usually Protestant Reformation is seen as, against papacy, against Roman Catholic, but I see it as part of the same story. From an Eastern point of view, it's just another wave of reformational Christianity in different form.
It makes sense, Father, when you read Calvin. Calvin's just using Augustine, and then he's coming right out of the papal. You're right. His language is so similar. It's true.
Absolutely. I mean,
and
Calvin's
dark and scary.
Yeah, there's a continuity there for sure. And a lot of the Protestant reformers had goals that are comparable to the effort to evangelize the saeculum. Luther was all about evangelizing the saeculum. The Puritans were all about evangelizing the saeculum. They couldn't stand the dancing and the celebration of Christmas. They actually banned Christmas, the Calvinist Puritans in New England and so forth. But the really big thing there, John, was the wars of Western religion.
Okay. Now,
anyone who goes through high school or college in our culture in the West hears about the wars of religion. That is to say, like Christians, Roman Catholic and Protestant, fight these horrible wars against each other in the 16th and especially 17th century.
Constantly.
Those were wars of Western religion. There were no Orthodox participants in these wars of any significance at all. They were Roman Catholics against Protestants fighting a kind of a Western war, a series of wars. When those horrible wars are over, it is such a disgrace for Christian civilization to look back on millions of people killed in the name of the God of love, cruelly, horribly. The rape of Magdeburg, unbelievable story during the 30 Years' War. It is such a scandal for the educated of the West that they they simply, they're just kind of done with it. They move on now. They take what Petrarch and those other humanists up to More had begun to pioneer, a secular humanism, and then they settle on that exclusively. Now, if those wars hadn't happened, we wouldn't have seen the Enlightenment and its anti-Christian character with Rousseau and Voltaire.
This is the reach for science, and then I would call scientism. This is the reach to turn that method of studying material into a method for living a life as a culture. The scientism, maybe you can speak to that. Maybe we're going off the rails a little bit, but I think what you just said is perfect, spot on historically, which is if you read Jefferson and all the founding fathers, they just don't want any part of that world. Mm-hmm, and so they go down another path. And I find them all reaching for Francis Bacon, all these guys reaching for science as the method. You know, the church had a method, even the Catholic Church with its papal reforms, but the East always had a method for making sense of the world around you. And I find like science becomes a replacement. I don't know what you think about that, but
I think so. It's a revolution in cosmology. So no longer do we have a dualistic cosmology that was maybe pioneered by Augustine without these intentions. Augustine's a saint. Augustine was a holy man. Augustine was a faithful Christian, but he did offer the West this model of a cosmology in which there's this seculum, this secular area of neutrality. And Francis Bacon, you mentioned him, 17th century, he's writing in the context of those religious wars. Descartes actually fought on both sides of those religious wars for a while.
Crazy.
And they both developed this dualism. Descartes, philosophical dualism, mind and matter, right?
Right.
And Bacon develops this conviction that science is going to solve human problems. He even writes a utopian book in which he talks about paradise being recovered through the scientific method. Wow. Rather than, through asceticism and love for one's
right. That
neighbor.
method's over. Right. So then here's a kind of I hope what amounts to something like a relevant WAWTAR question for you. All of this history for people who don't care too much about history, I already see its relevance because I love history and taught it and everything. And I think you and I could go on and on. But just picture someone sitting in their chair, they're flipping through Apple News or whatever they're doing, and they're trying to figure out there's something afoot. And how does the story really apply to them? How does the changing cosmology lead to personal despair, or if it's not despair, a deep sense of a loss of a spiritual life? Like, who cares? So what?
Yeah. It's a complex question, John, but I think it can be answered in that what the story tells us, if this story is correct or is correct on a lot of points, the story tells us that the West, as a integral civilization, had something in it that got deformed. And out of this there arose this kind of counterfeit culture, this counterfeit system of beliefs and values, which centered upon the human experience in this world, the seculum, secular humanism. And secular humanism itself could not sustain itself. And by World War I, Russian Revolution, Stalinism, Nazism, stock market crash, whatever you want to point to, the consumer culture we live in today, in which we're just products of desire and we are nothing but our desires. Humanism is a counterfeit of traditional Christianity. So traditional Christianity provides what I call, what I talk a lot about, it's a transformational imperative. Christianity has built within it, traditional Christianity has built within it, the need for transformation, spiritual transformation. That spiritual transformation becomes harder and harder to achieve in an atmosphere or a culture of pessimism, such as I described before Petrarch. Petrarch takes that transformational imperative and he projects it into the seculum.
That's right.
So that the secular neutral, spiritually neutral area of civilization becomes the area where Francis Bacon and other scientists after him,
they fill it up.
They fill it up and they live out that transformational imperative in a secular rather than spiritual form. And the result is it creates a satisfying, the satisfaction of the need of Western culture, but it's a counterfeit to traditional Christianity, leaving people dissatisfied, empty, and unfilled by, trips to Walmart, to use your example.
Yeah. Well, and also, as you were speaking, I thought it is transformation. I mean, think about what we tell, 11-year-olds. What do you want to become what do you want to be when you grow older? As if they're not something already. So there's this deep, profound, I always found that as one of the most psychologically challenging questions I ever had when I was 11. What am I want to be when I grow older? That's terrifying. That's a type of, continuous transformation, and you have to do it to yourself. So there's a lot of fear in that, but also, to what end? What's the telos? When you listen, there's a lot of folks online right now, Pajot and others. There is no telos in the change. There's no purpose. It's just for change's sake. I think of it almost like a hit of cocaine, like crack cocaine. It feels good to change. It feels good to lose 10 pounds, but why again? Well, why am I in that transformational, almost addiction? Toward what? I mean, can you help us? What's the modern secular, what are we changing toward? Is there an answer? I don't think so.
Yeah. One of the things that I point to, when I think about this, talk about this, is Paul's statement in Romans. He says, do not be conformed. I like the language he uses here. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Be transformed. And I think that's what traditional Christianity calls on us to do, is to be transformed spiritually, not to be conformed to some model that we have in this world of career success, to use that example of, asking an 11-year-old what he wants to be, or losing 10 pounds of weight or something like that, or having a great, fulfilling, relationship of 6 months with someone, when you're in your 20s, but making no commitments and going on to someone else afterward.
Right. These
things will spend themselves, and they'll exhaust themselves, and they'll leave us with no telos, no satisfaction.
So perhaps the humanist experiment, the Petrarch's experiment, maybe not him so much, but eventually it ends in a secular world, a secular culture. There's nothing transcendent about the transformation. Does that feel right to you? Is that might be what's happening in 2021?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think the absence of transcendence becomes a terrible weakness of Western culture, beginning with the Enlightenment, even earlier, but certainly with the Enlightenment, when Christianity is largely rejected as a legitimate source of Western values after the wars of Western religion, and beginning with the Enlightenment. You mentioned Thomas Jefferson, I mentioned Rousseau and Voltaire. What we find happening is that there's this assertion that this world is the only legitimate space in which to act out on the transformational imperative. And so there's revolutions like the French Revolution that take place, but that shocks everyone because of its unrestrained violence.
Right.
And so you get a reaction to the French Revolution called the Romantic movement, where people turn inward. And then if you look at this, John, if you look at the Romantics, they were desperately seeking something transcendent. So if you look at Beethoven's music, for instance, he's trying to make music that's going to transform the world, and if you don't understand me and my music, what's wrong with you, shaking his fist at the heavens when he dies, by legend and so forth. You look at Hegel with his world spirit, talk about a invented transcendence. The world spirit of Hegel is this largely kind of invented idea that the spiritual realm realizes itself through human affairs.
Right.
You look at someone like Emerson in America and his oversoul, which he really just draws from the Hindus. He gets this idea that there's some sort of impersonal transcendent reality to human society that gives society its meaning. But no one really can buy this. No one believes this stuff. And by the early stages of the Romantic movement, people are going crazy over this. You look at the story of Romantic painters and composers, and especially poets. They're all killing themselves. They're all writing, works of ranting and raving. Look at Tchaikovsky. I love Tchaikovsky. I just love Tchaikovsky. But you look at his story, it's just this agonizing, desperate effort to find something to hold on to. And at the end of his life, he composes his greatest work, I think, the Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique, which is this just soul-crushing cry into the darkness of nothingness, because it's all emotions at that point.
And it's because the circuit is closed. It's because the transformation is it's for itself. And
yes.
Which makes a ton of sense, which again is why I have empathy for postmodern, not just philosophers, but people struggling in the postmodern world. I get what they're doing. I get what they're groping for. I'm probably one of them. And so how do you hold on to your love of Beethoven and Tchaikovsky, even as they sort of tell a story of despair in a lot of ways? How do you do that?
Good question. I'm not really sure. I mean, I would say that at my best of times, I can detach from them. Sure. The story I tell in Age of Utopia is, has a lot to say about Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, and company. And I'm worried that when it's released and people read it, they're going to think I hate romantic classical music, because I'm just exposing what I think are the weaknesses of this false transcendence. But that's probably a good sign, because I think it's detachment. It's the ability to, enjoy these beautiful things that exactly. The secular culture has produced. And the West has done this more than, that's why the West and its secular culture has been so profoundly transformative on a global scale, because of the core Christian transformational imperative it inherited from the first millennium.
Wow.
Even when secularized, and especially because it became secularized, produced this explosive and brilliant culture that the rest of the world is just in awe over.
Am I using your words? The motivation of a young man or woman who goes off to Mount Athos to be a monk, their motivation is transformation and transcendence. That engine, which changes the world, let's just be honest. Christianity changes the world. Christ is incarnate. But that engine itself, let's not call it hijacked. Let's be fair. That engine is moved into the world, into the secular, and it runs hard. It runs fast, and people use it. And the world does get transformed. We have to, I like what you're saying. You do have to get it credit. But the question is how long can we run on that engine? How long can we keep putting gas in that if it doesn't reach something transcendent?
Yeah.
And I don't know how long, and who knows, maybe we're both wrong. I don't know. Maybe this is how the world works. But you said something really interesting. You're not going to be nice to me in a minute. I didn't call you out, but I see that you love classical music, and I love it. And it makes perfect sense to me. And you helped me, because I love reggae music. And if you listen to the Rastas, like I had some on earlier tonight, the Rastas are very aware of Babylon, and Babylon is this notion in their music of that thing you're calling the secular machine, the consumer machine, the thing that got really caught on fire with the New World. And they sing against it all the time. Now, they also sing about Haile Selassie being a god. And I learned detachment in loving reggae music. I can listen to it and appreciate it and understand it. And I really enjoy all the bass rhythms and all the one drop and everything. But I know there's something right there that I can't fully embrace, but I do enjoy it. Does that make me crazy? I love it. I don't know that Rasta music and classical music can go together, but somehow I feel like they do right now.
I grew up listening to The Clash, right, in the 1980s, and they were influenced by a lot of Rasta music and so forth. The Clash, yeah.
Well, we're all swimming in it. We're all swimming in modernity. We can't really help it. And I love the idea that we just went over, is that the Puritan inclination to strike it all. I mean, you can try. It hasn't gone well in history when people do that. So how would you end this story? You're going to end the story with a couple more books. How does this all look to you right now in this new world we're in? Is it going to bend back, do you think, towards something old? A lot of people are saying that there will be a return to something more, how should we say, traditional. Do you see that happening?
I see something like that going on right now. I don't know. I mean, and there are other people who are more prescient than I am. You know, my focus is obviously on the past. I'm thinking about the present, studying the past, and I'm not a good cultural analyst. But I think there is something going on right now in the culture. There's a kind of a loss of confidence. You mentioned the postmodern movement, for instance. I think that's probably a sign that the modernity project is not going to sustain us forever. But what we're going to go back to, I don't know. I mean, there were prophetic Christian voices like Nicholas Berdyaev in the middle of the 20th century talking about the new Middle Ages, you know, and he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of people talking about how, you know, humanism has robbed humanity of what makes humanity really human. And he talks about dehumanization. It's really an ironic and interesting argument he makes. Secular humanism dehumanizes humanity, because when we're no longer linked to God, the transcendent God who is immanent as well through the incarnation, we no longer bear his image. We're no longer deified by his presence in our lives sacramentally and liturgically.
Wow.
When that happens, what do we get? Stalin, Nazism, American consumerism, that sort of stuff.
Well, you get the Tower of Babel. You get people taking control and building the culture and the image of themselves.
Oh, I was going to say my answer is nihilism, an age of nihilism. That's the tentative title of my final volume. Takes us up to the
thank you for that.
Cold Wars.
Thank you for that. I really want to thank you for coming on. And I really liked it. We were getting excited. We were getting into it. I really liked it. Thank you for coming on. And it really helps support our work. So from Washington, I hope you liked that. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, it was good, John. Thanks for having me on. And I'll look forward to another conversation sometime.
And we will definitely do it. And we'll get into the stuff that was just popping here at the end as our internet went bad. But I really want to thank you. Peace to you. Let's stay in touch, okay? Thank you, Father.
Wonderful. Yeah, John, anytime.
Okay. Take
God
care.
Bless you.
And see you soon. Thanks for coming on.
Bye-bye.
Well, Father, as he signs off, Father John Strickland and I ripping some history. To you, Father, Shenis Gagimarjos. That said, at a KP table, sometimes called a supra in the Georgian Republic, we're deeply invested in that tradition because that tradition is basically what we do at First Things Foundation. And you are being asked, even at this moment, to consider contributing to our work. We love recurring donors, 5, 10, 15, 20, 100, however many dollars you can put into our pockets. Well, each month, if you do that, we know where we can work and who we can help. And there's a lot to be done. Go look at our website, www.firstthings.org, first-things.org. Check it out. But mostly keep coming on to the podcast because we're building beautiful networks with people who, well, help us do what I think of as very beautiful things. At First Things Foundation, where we help local people, local, often impoverished people, realize their vision for their own future and their own idea of a better life. This is John Heers. This is WAWTAR. Au revoir. Kagi Marjos, Nakvamdis, Kambufo, Nawe. See you later.